group of people, and sometimes you have to coordinate inside the stakeholder, inside the multi-stakeholder. So I've been doing that from before, so I found it quite natural for me. But now it has become a real good issue for all of us. And thank you for the invitation, really.
Thank you very much. Sebastian, was it natural for you, this term?
As I have a small presentation, I want to...
No, presentation later. Just
but it's...
Small?
That's the answer of your question. And give the floor to somebody else.
Okay. I will ask you to return to it later. Wolfgang, was it natural for you to hear, or you just introduced this term?
I think it goes back to already the 60s or the 70s when Daniel Bell wrote a nice book and said, okay, the nation state is too big for the small issues and too small for the global issues, and we have to find other ways to manage things. And so from this, you had a debate in political science that next to governments you need... can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. That next to governments, other parts of the society has to play a more active role. In this context here of internet and information society, my memory tells me that in the first time that, a conference ended with a declaration or with declarations, which were adopted not only by government but also by other groups, was in 1995 in the OECD meeting, which took place in Bonn in Germany. And this meeting adopted 3 declarations. It was a governmental declaration, users declaration, and a private sector declaration. This was interesting. It was about principles of the information society. And this was no interaction among the stakeholders, but you had 3 different meetings. So the users had a meeting, the private sector had a meeting, and the governments had a meeting. And when the G7, at this time it was still the G7, had also a meeting on the global information infrastructure with Al Gore and Mr. Bangerman, there were 2 meetings. One was the governmental meeting, and then there was the business roundtable. And it was also in the middle of the 90s. And what I saw was that the journalists, moved to the business roundtables. They said, okay, we know what the governments are saying, so that means the interest, the public interest, moved from the governmental level on such a very high G7 summit meeting to the business level. And insofar, it was not a surprise that when the United Nations started to prepare the World Summit in 2001, to say, okay, we cannot do it only with governments, we have to invite the others. And then in the business process, I think the whole concept became a little bit more elaborated, became a little bit more clear. And I think in particular the working group on internet governance, helped to push this concept to the center of the debate, because the conflict in 2003 in the first phase of the World Summit was a conflict between, we could say, the Chinese government and the US government. The US government argued the internet should be managed by the private sector, so it was private sector leadership. And the Chinese government argued private sector leadership was good for 1 million internet users, but now we have nearly 1 billion users, and now we need governmental leadership. So the question was, what is internet? Private sector leadership, governmental leadership? If I have no answer, I create a working group. This was done, and the working group had then to struggle with this conflict, and the solution was the internet does not need a leader. So all stakeholders have to be involved in their respective roles. So that means the multi-stakeholder concept was really, with regard to internet governance, a compromise between these 2 positions, private sector leadership and governmental leadership. And now we see that that was absolutely correct, because what we see is the emergence of an internet governance ecosystem. So it's impossible to manage the internet with one single organization or with one stakeholder. So that means we see this diversification and multiplication of more members of this internet governance ecosystem, and it's the only way how you can manage the internet. That means all ideas to bring this back into a one stakeholder mode or in one organization mode, would fail and would create more problems and more conflict. So it's complex, it's complicated, it's difficult to understand, and a lot of things has to be done. In particular, we need more, let's say, elaborated practices and procedures for the interaction among the stakeholders. So we see this now in ICANN, how difficult it is to bring the Government Advisory Committee into a certain procedural relationship with the board. So, and the answer for the moment is early engagement. So that means if the governments wait until non-governmental stakeholder produce a policy and then they say yes or no, this is the old hierarchical approach. But the bottom-up and not the top-down approach is needed. In a bottom-up process, all stakeholders are involved in policy making from the early moment. But for governments, I understand it, it's not so easy, how to become engaged at an early stage in a bottom-up policy development process. This is new territory. We have to invent something, and I think this is the beauty of the process, that we are really, moving into uncharted territory, or as Bill Clinton has said, we are stumbling forward. So as long as the direction is the right direction, then let's stumble forward.
Thank you very much. Cheryl, when did you hear for the first time this term?
Thank you for the question, Oksana. My name's Cheryl Langdenor, and I've worn a number of hats in the wonderful world of the internet since it was well before the World Wide Web. The one I'm probably labelled for here, however, is as the domain name administrator in a country code called .au. But to answer your question specifically, probably multi-stakeholderism and bottom-up consensus building, I think I would separate. Those things didn't come together, in my experience, until really ICANN and more recent times. From an observation point of view on humanity, we tend to like to gather together with like. So if we have similarity of purpose, similarity of interest, excuse me, the peer support mechanisms that go well back, probably till the 20s and 30s, were the very beginnings of having a seat at the table. And to me, multi-stakeholderism is the ability to have the voice that is at the seat at the table. We can't have a table of several billion people. That just does not work. But we do need to have people at the table who are representing the interests of all of those who have that combined point, that nexus, that unified issue that we're interested in. In this case, we're interested in internet. So ISOC, back at the very beginning of the Internet Society, and obviously the IETF, were models that I thought were worthy and certainly something we should be expanding on, where an aggregation of voice comes together and a common agreement or common disagreement is outcome. When we designed AuDA, the way that the country code in Australia is designed, we specifically designed a multi-stakeholder model. The purpose of our organisation was to bring government, industry generally, business, small, big and large, and domain name industry specifically, as well as consumer interests, to the table equitably. So that was sort of a hard definition of multi-stakeholderism, and to some extent the beginnings of the bottom-up consensus policy. But of course the experiment, that is ICANN, and Wolfgang alluded to that, that is where we become a bottom-up consensus building multi-stakeholder model. And that's something that is, I would suggest, still radical, still becomes a little uncomfortable for some people to operate in. And it goes back to that feeling comfortable with like agreeing with like. And what I think is wonderful about the Internet Governance Forum and its version of a multi-stakeholder model is that it pushes all of us just to the edges of our comfort zone, because of the way we have to have equal voice. with business, with civil society, and with government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Martin, what is your experience with multi-stakeholderism, first experience?
Thank you, Oksana. My name is Martin Boyle. I'm with Nominet, which is the .uk internet domain name registry, but for many years I've worked for the UK government before joining Nominet about 4 years ago. And I think I'd sort of go right back to the beginning of my career, where the very nature of the UK government was that we were expected to go out and engage with stakeholders because the issues we were dealing with were very complex and very hard to understand, and it's very easy to trigger the law of unintended consequences. You don't properly understand the interrelationships of the issues, and therefore you do something that bluntly is just plain stupid. And that's not a good thing to do, for fairly obvious reasons. I think, though, what I'd see as being different was that during all those years of my life working for the government service, your engagement with stakeholders tended to be issues-based and in silos. So you would go out and you would talk to one stakeholder group at a time. Now fast forward to when I first learned how to spell internet, which was about 2003. When I took on the Internet Governance dossier in the Ministry and started engaging in the World Summit on the Information Society. Firstly, I was actually very shocked that a process excluded stakeholders. Stakeholders were ejected from the room very early in the discussion, and then just a load of policy wonks like me sat round a table and argued about something which we really did not understand what the consequences of some of those decisions were going to be. That's a very unhealthy environment in which to be, and certainly for my government, a very alien environment to be. So you heard earlier speakers, in particular Wolfgang, talking about the process that moved us to something that I think is really fundamental. It's not the stakeholder in his silo or her silo. It's not just going to business and hearing the business view and then going along to the civil society groups and hearing their views and then trying to put it together. It's trying to understand that interrelationship so that you pick out what the concerns are, and you try to find that happy environment in the middle, not you the government official, but you the communities that are involved in that process. And for me, that's where multi-stakeholderism, what a horrible word, but never mind, that's where the multi-stakeholderism actually becomes an added value in the process. You are going to get something more out of it on one condition, and that is that people engage positively and constructively in the process. And as you start evolving, you start explaining to people what it is they're doing. And that is something that since joining Nominet reformed its policy process, very much putting in at the base of this a multi-stakeholder engagement model. But what for us is key is that people understand and can find the link to their concerns and how that concern is dealt with when you come out with the solution. Now, this is actually fundamentally important because as soon as you have, and in particular now looking at it from a private sector company taking its policy advice, it's very easy for people to turn around later on and say, well, you would do that, wouldn't you? You've done what you wanted to do all along. It looks closed, it looks like it isn't transparent. And you've got to try and make sure that A, it is open, and B, it looks open. And that it can only be done by people understanding the final motivation for your decision.
Thank you very much. We have remote participants from Pakistan. Naveed, do you hear me? Maybe we can have... Yes? Here it is.
He's connected.
Hello?
But we...
Hello, Naveed. Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. Please introduce yourself very shortly and describe your first experience with multi-stakeholderism as a term. Thank you.
Hello?
His microphone is...
Okay, Naveed, we will return to you later because Wolfgang has to go to the plenary, and I would like to ask one more question to Wolfgang. Do you expect any concrete results from this session? What do you think? What has to be a priority for the discussion during this workshop about multi-stakeholderism, about understanding, translation this term, and implementation? What threats and what may be the main hopes for it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You know, this is a program for, research project. But anyhow, you know, what I think, there are two things, which probably could be important for the years ahead. One is indeed a better understanding of the nature of multi-stakeholderism, a horrible word, as it was said already, Martin. And what does it mean? It means exactly what Martin has outlined. It's not only, that each stakeholder is recognized. So it's the challenge to find this interaction among the stakeholders. So this mixture, so that all, positions, motivations, aspirations are coming together to a joint solution. I think the example in the technical world is the IGF. So that means it's issue-based, as Martin has said. That means in the IGF, you define an issue, and then you ask others, is this an issue? And if you have a critical mass of people who agree with you that this is an issue, then you start a working group, and you are asking for comments. So it's a request for comment. And then you say, I think this is the solution. What do you think? Is this the right solution? And then people make contributions. So it's an unstructured way. But if you have to say something, then you have a channel, to say something. So, but if you have nothing to say, then you can sit in the room and be silent. And if you have nothing to say and are not interested, you can step outside. So there is no obligation to do it. So, and this has worked for the technology, and I think this is an interesting source of inspiration also for policy making in the future. This is certainly a tremendous shift from traditional policy making, which is totally different. And also decision making in a traditional way is with 51% in the parliament. But rough consensus in such a multi-stakeholder, bottom-up, open, transparent process is different from the 51 majority in the parliament. So I think we have to clarify this, and this will need time. 5 years, 10 years, I don't know. It's not done from today to tomorrow. And the other thing which I think is important for the years ahead is what we see now, and this is also the subject of discussion in the plenary, an emergence of more and more declarations of principles for internet governance. The OECD, the Council of Europe, the G7, the British Foreign Minister, the Chinese Foreign Minister, everybody now comes and says we need principles, and we have, I have counted 25 documents now which define principles. Governments make principles, the private sector makes principles, civil society makes principles. So, but the weakness of all these principles is that they are either one stakeholder principles, so it's done by the private sector or done by the governments or done by the civil society, or it's limited in the scope. In the OECD, which has a multi-stakeholder process for the declaration, it's only 33 member states. In the Council of Europe, it's only 47 member states. So what the IGF can provide is a space where the whole world is involved and all stakeholders are involved. That means we have to go to a universal document with principles, non-binding, which is multi-stakeholder, not adopted finally by the governments, but adopted by all stakeholders. That means by the Chinese and by the American government, by the IETF and by ICANN, by Google and by Facebook, and by the APC and the Human Rights Watch. So this is the challenge. If we are able to create, a set of principles like internet governance has to be based on human rights. The policy model is multi-stakeholderism. The internet has to be open. Policy processes has to be transparent. Very short, very meta principles. The internet should be safe and secure. The internet should be based on the end-to-end principle or the architecture. So if we could agree on very simple, very high-level principles, similar to the Human Rights Declaration, where we said there should be no torture, there should be freedom of expression, there should be freedom to travel. So very general principles. This would be a really step forward, so that then all stakeholders have a commitment and cannot say, okay, this is just for the private sector, this is just for the governments. This mingling of the stakeholders is the challenge for the years ahead. Thank you, and I have to apologize, but I have to go to another session.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. Do we have Navid now?
Navid, do you hear us?
Okay, Sebastian, I am extremely sorry for interrupting you. Please show us your presentation. And I would like to explain, I am really highly appreciate your accepting my invitation, but I would like to explain why I invite each of us, because all of you great experts in all spheres of multi-stakeholderism. But for example, Sebastian for me is the most essential part of working model of multi-stakeholderism as I can. Sebastian, how do you feel as a part of this multi-stakeholderism structure, and what makes a multi-stakeholder model? Is it enough only to put the name multi-stakeholderism, to collect representatives from at least 3 constituencies, or anything more? Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Sorry, I prepare a presentation because I would like to go totally outside of internet and to talk about where I first meet something who could be named multi-stakeholder. Of course, it was not named like that because it was in France, and this word doesn't exist in French. And it was an organization set up in 1965, and it's a long time ago. Of course, I really be too young, even if I am now quite old, to be involved at that time. But when I was student, I went through this organization named UCPA. I will tell you a little bit more. It's why I make some slide to be easy to understand. And it's an organization who take care of organizing youth holidays for outdoor sports. And it's really an organization where they take care of youth from now 6 to 17, and then 18 to 35, I guess. and it was specifically organized. In fact, it was a merge of two organizations set up after the Second World War, and it was important to have at that time already the participation to the people who were involved in the war as resistance, and the government and other organizations. Then it's why this merge in 1965 were important. Today we have 45 years of experience. It's 80 different sport activity. It's 143 sites to practice, including outside of France. It's a real worldwide presence, and there is 9 million of young who went to this facility, usually for 1 week of practice, ski, scuba diving, tennis, whatever you want to do outside. And it's an organization who gather government representative and local authority, who gather major youth and popular education movement and made sport federation in France. And you have a long list, and I try to make a small design and try to make comparison. As we said in France, comparison is not reason, but it could be interesting to see that we have the government, we have the youth organization, and we have the sport organization. If I take, I'm sorry, I forgot to switch UCPA in the second one, for example, for ICANN. We have the GAC, we have one supporting organization, and we have the ALAC. Is it fully multi-stakeholder? Maybe not, but in 1965 it quite advanced. Then I was involved as board member and chair of the committee dealing with the activities, sport activities, since in 1984 when I was a student to 2006, and that's where the first time I met with multi-stakeholderism. That was my presentation. Now the question is where in fact in internet world it was in 2001 when I start to participate to the ICANN meeting. As a matter of fact, next meeting will be my 40 ICANN meeting. It's too much, but it was really a total discovery, because even in France we don't have in the internet arena really multi-stakeholder organization. Even if we take the .fr, the AFNIC organization, the government, or at least it's not at all equal. The government representatives are the majority of the board of AFNIC. You have 2 representatives from the registrar, and you have 2 representatives from the user. Up to 5 years ago it was 2 from the business, because .fr was just open for businesses, and then when it was open for physical person, for end user, we in fact were involved in this board, and ISOC France take the second seat and represent the end user. But it's still not equal at all, and maybe there could be other stakeholders to be involved. It's why the ICANN is quite interesting. We have a lot of progress to do. It's difficult to involve since the beginning everybody. It's difficult to be equal, to have the voice of everybody here. But in the same time, it's the best place today to try to do it, and we have, I am sure, a lot of things to do in the future to enhance this this organization. The fact that we will have new GTLDs and we will have a new participation, hopefully, of a new registry, and it will be the first constituency tomorrow if we are not taking care of participation of other, because for the moment it's the registrar who are the possible participants, it's around 900. And the registry, it could be 1,000, a little bit more. We need to take care that the other part of the organization are not diluted and not put in the way that they are the voice less heard because they are not the same number of participants. It's not to say that everyone needs to be with more than 1,000 participants each time, but it needs to be built to have the voice equally heard in each and everybody in this organization. It's a quite interesting challenge for the next few years, I think. I will stop here because I think I was already too long, but I am happy to answer other questions later. Thank you, Oksana, and thank you for inviting me to this workshop.
Thank you very much. Once again, Navid. No? Maybe you can ask him to write some words, and maybe you can just read it later. And now, Cheryl, I know that, yes, you are ready to discuss all aspects of multi-stakeholderism, but I would like to ask you to put a special accent on transparency, accountability, conflict of interest, all your experience regarding it. I understand that it volumes, but please, very important things.
Thank you, Oksana. Yes, indeed. Accountability and transparency, and as Martin alluded to, these are not just apparent, they need to be actual things. A multi-stakeholder model cannot function effectively, and I would argue siloed models cannot function effectively with trust unless accountability and transparency is blatantly obvious. Now, I had the honour of serving on the very first post-affirmation of commitments with ICANN, community-based external review team for accountability and transparency. And as one of what I would suggest is an excellent model and yes, experiment, which is still evolving in multi-equal, thank you Fadi for that, multi-stakeholderism from a bottom-up consensus-built policy way, and we need to make another word out of that. This is way too long to keep saying all of those words. I found that the lack of trust and understanding, even within that very good model, was shocking when we started picking at the surface. And this was because of silos. When one is focused on the work at hand, and you are producing and contributing, and you're part of this multi-stakeholder model, it is so easy to simply drill down and not look to the left and the right. There was amazing lack of understanding in our community that led to perceived problems where there were none, complaints where there really oughtn't to have been anything to complain about, and it came down to two things: the ability to observe and know what is going on. If you close a door and build a wall, people will assume the worst. If we are not given information as humans, we fill in the details, and they're usually far, far more evil in nature than they actually are. And the other thing, and I think this is probably the most important thing, and this is clear, unambiguous information and effective communication. And that is something that I would challenge none of our multi-stakeholder model examples today have done well enough yet. I do not believe the IETF does it well enough. I do not believe ISOC does it well enough. I believe ICANN is now trying to do a better job of it. Yay team. But AUDA, and I suspect others sitting at this table, still need to do a better job of that. As a board member, and I'm a member of a number of boards, we get down to our business and we forget that our business is not as obvious to those we serve. It's not easy. It takes time. You have to do outreach. And you have to make sure you engage beyond your community, because most of us have roles in things that affect way beyond. What we do affects registrants and internet users who aren't even registrants and internet users yet. It's only 2-point-something billion. There's a few more to come along online. So an accountability and transparency framework needs to be created, and created with community input. So that in itself needs to be a multi-stakeholder model. It needs to be clear, understood, and it needs to evolve. Because putting it in a folder and sticking it on the shelf is not an effective model. That's a plan, that's a program, that might get you through ISO 9002, but it's not actual communication, it is not transparency, and it certainly is not accountability. But we also need to be very clear in that model who we are accountable to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Once again about Navid, please show me when you will be ready to read his message, okay?
Pardon, whose message?
Navid message.
Okay, okay.
Now, Olga, again, one of aspect of all your activity, education, awareness raising, understanding of this horrible term in English into other languages. Please go ahead.
Does multi-stakeholderism exist in Spanish? Multiparticipatividad. That's even worse than English. Okay, whatever. I think that Cheryl and also Martin made very good points about what I would like to say is that first there are some established process of multi-stakeholderism that not necessarily are so transparent and so open. So we as participants should be aware that of that. And sometimes all the scene is set and some things are already arranged, and they put some people participating in the last moment. Oh, we all participate and we all agree, but really there was not a real process of contribution and interaction before. So we have to be aware of this. Other thing that I have seen in several organizations that I participate, or groups of working groups, is that sometimes they are captured by some participants that they say they represent something. Really, we all in this multi-stakeholder process are ourselves. I myself, I am advisor of the government of Argentina, but the government of Argentina has many other organizations, institutions, ministries, undersecretaries, secretaries, and I would be myself very unreal if I would say that I have a voice for all the government of Argentina. What I can say is that I can come back to my government and I ask specific questions to certain ministries, certain representatives. But I myself, I'm Olga, with all my background and a teacher and a mother from Argentina, and I can have some more internal perspective of my country and my community. But indeed, we are all individuals from certain stakeholders, and I've seen that also in civil society. An organization represents such and such and such, and really it's the person with some involvement in that organization that has to have a multi-stakeholder process from inside to give this person a representativity. So we have to be careful for that. And I like Sherry's comments about outreach and participation, because I think that's the key. Oksana is a good example. She was a student in Meissen, and I was teacher there. And she was so active, and so she went to all of us and talked to all of us and tried to understand this process. And she's deeply involved, and she is now organizing nice workshops, and she has done a difference for her country. And it's herself. But she has this multi-stakeholder approach. But she was so kind to talk to many people and to learn, and also to give this voice to her country. So what I see is that outreach and teaching is essential to bring more people, because how can you break this capturing? Bring in more people and have some discussion, and finally this capturing will go away and more transparency and more participation will happen. But that happens only through relevant involvement of new actors, and that you get with outreach. And this is something that I've been struggling in ICANN, because there are some regions which are more outreached, like I would say Australia is a good example, somehow Asia Pacific, North America, Europe, but Latin America and Africa are lacking behind. This is why we are involved in some outreach activities in Latin America. We want participation, but relevant participation, not being sitting there and raising hand, just because you're sitting there, you're giving consensus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now my question to Martin. I am extremely interested in your experience with CCTLD redelegation process. What the role of understanding of any signs of multi-stakeholderism regarding CCTLD administration plays in this process? What examples did you see? And when we are talking about quasi-democratic countries, when we are talking about authoritarian countries, it's obviously that the role of government is overloaded. But did you see any evidence of governmental vacuum in this process? Thank you.
Thanks. I really love the easy questions. But firstly, I'd like just to say that both from Olga and Cheryl, they've made some excellent points. I think they're very, very important. I would fully endorse, and in particular, there are things about transparency needing to be blatantly obvious, and even when you think you're doing well, actually you're probably not doing as well as you thought you were. You've got to keep on doing it. You've got to properly understand. More importantly, and perhaps this point wasn't made strongly enough, they both made it, but it's something that I think is fundamental to the process. Stakeholders have to understand the relevance of the issue to them. And some of these issues are horribly complex, and people go away and they don't really understand why they're being invited. And underlying that is the human being's reluctance to change. Well, it's all going okay, fine. Why would we bother to do anything different? They need to understand what that motivation is, why they need to start thinking about it, and they need to understand how any change might affect different groups of people, not just them, but the other people as well. And that, I said it in the first round, but I don't think I said it clearly enough. The multi-stakeholderism is that understanding the other people's point of view. If you don't do that, if you don't come to the table trying to do that, you're not going to end up with the multi-stakeholderism that you need. Now I'll try and answer Oksana's question, which, as I say, is a very difficult question. It's one that's gone on for a very long time, and one in which, firstly, I have to say with some relief that in the UK we have not had to worry about. We haven't had a redelegation, and please, may we not. But fundamentally, when I joined the GAC in 2003, very quickly I was worried about the processes and the thinking that was that was in place that talked about the delegation of a CCTLD. And I got involved in a process, and this was as a government official, in talking. I think I'm about to sneeze. Excuse me. Yeah, sorry about that. Very quickly it dawned on me that the basis on which we were working forgot that a CCTLD fundamentally responds to that local community to which it is supposed to serve. And we spent in the GAC, I think it was about 2 years, working on what principles should be in the background for delegation and redelegation of CCTLDs. And the fundamental thing, and it's in Article 1.2, very neatly with a box around it so that people don't miss it, that delegation and redelegation are a national issue. And we use the word because this was very largely active an activity among the European GAC members. That this was so fundamentally important that the delegation and redelegation should be, and another absolutely horrible word, respond to subsidiarity. In other words, the decisions are made closest to the communities that are going to be affected. And in that process, I did a lot of talking to my own CCTLD. I did a lot of talking to a number of sort of users of the internet, which is quite a big group, to inform my engagement, my input to that discussion. And I think this was at that time quite a good thing for the GAC. The GAC, when it did a draft, sent the draft around to the CCNSO, to CCTLD community, and asked them whether we'd actually got it right. Now, the process still wasn't good because there was the government sitting in their rooms talking about a document to establish principles, but eventually what came out of that document was quite good. The difficulty was that because we'd done it in our room, nobody properly sort of turned around and said, what are the implications of that to the wider community? So that was 2005 when we agreed it. I joined Nominet in 2008. Since then, the world has moved on. Most notably, the fundamental part of the delegation and redelegation is that you change a file in the routing system. This is, for those people who know, called the IANA function. And the US government have got and I'm going to get the words wrong because these are very politically charged words, but the US government supervise and contract that function out to the private sector to operate. And they went through a process to rebid the IANA contract, and they did something that for contracting terms, even in the UK government, would have been quite a surprising thing to do. They drafted an initial paper, and they went out to the world and they said, tell us if we've got it right. And they'd done a lot of talking to people first, but they got lots and lots of comments, and they listened. Which again, very, very good, because it's always encouraging to take the nice bits and leave away the difficult ones. And then they tried again, and they produced a new document, and they said, hey guys, have we heard you properly? And so another wave of comments, and in both of those waves of comments, the Nominet, because it was directly of interest and import to us, responded, as did quite a lot of other people. And then they produced their contract document, but in doing it said, this is how we've taken into account the various things that we have heard. Now, this is not properly multi-stakeholderism. This is a consultation, but it is actually a good engagement. And as Cheryl just said in my ear, yes, it's a step, a very important first step. One of the fundamental things that came out of that document was to say that managing the IANA function doesn't take away that responsibility at the local level, the local law, and it doesn't mean you making decisions that are not based on a fundamental community-based policy developments. And this, again, music to my ears, that it is open for that multi-stakeholder engagement to define the framework in which you make your decisions, the policy for all CCTLDs and all the GTLDs are fundamental and very important. Now, the GTLDs have had their own process, and so we've now been, for the last 2 years, in the CCNSO working on the 2 documents that are in place, the original IETF request for comments and the GAC principles, to try and understand and put down in simple terms what these mean. But for me, still fundamentally, when we're going through that, that's just the top level. The important bit is still going to be at the country level of making those decisions. And those making those decisions, we can't tell governments, we can't tell the local communities how to do it, but pure experience tells me that talking about it, understanding the issues, and making sure that you've got that local consensus for how to do it has to be the fundamental route for that process. If you don't do that, then you're likely to end up having squabbles and arguments later on down the track. More importantly, the process then ceases to be relevant, it ceases to be effective, and it is not bringing the stakeholders in to help underpin those decisions that we might make. I'm highly conscious that that was very long, Oksana, but it was rather a difficult question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite all participants to put questions, or maybe to just a moment, or maybe to answer my question to all of you. What is more difficult, to understand the roles, the interest of other stakeholders, or to ensure the fulfillment of the respective role of each stakeholder? Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is John Laprise. I'm a professor at Northwestern University in Doha, Qatar. Also serve on the executive committee of the ISAC chapter there. I also work as a consulting scholar for ICT Qatar, which is the regulator and policymaker in Qatar. I'm not speaking on behalf of the government today. And actually I'm speaking as in my capacity on the ISAC chapter, and that is, I came to this panel, this workshop, with very high hopes, and I'm unfortunately at this point somewhat disappointed because Qatar is a monarchy. And in trying to build a multi-stakeholder approach or inviting that, there's a fundamental assumption in this whole discussion is that the people actually have some experience with that, of actually participating in a decision-making process. And the people I deal with in Qatar don't have that experience. And without that, everything you're talking about just doesn't help, because they don't come to the table in the first place. And I'm just looking for any kind of help to assist with that, because if the building blocks aren't there, I mean, lack of sort of consultative process, a lack of even sharing ideas about how things should happen, this whole process is really, really, really difficult.
I get there first. You next, Olga. Okay. Thank you for that question, and it got me kind of excited. As you saw, I started jumping up and down. We've used reference to metaphor of coming to the table. And it seems to me that an opportunity would exist when we need to find talent, engage, grow interest, upskill individuals. We have to create a table. And that would be a round table discussion where you can identify the verbally articulate, and I'm sorry, but this is not equitable. To start with, at the thin end of the wedge, you need the confident, verbally articulate, well-empowered individuals who will speak with the confidence and knowledge that they are not misrepresenting the wider community. I can't say that they would be representing the wider community, but as long as they cannot misrepresent, then that allows some critical mass to be built, and there you need mentoring. I actually think mentoring is a very useful tool. From my experience, not so much in the internet, but more in the trade environment, bringing industry participants, government observer, and a few hand-picked, often beginning in the academics, and just create the fora is a good first step. But when we're looking at monarchies or slightly tighter control regimes, we have to recognise that it's going to be a not about them without them system. You cannot act outside of the winning team. And it's exactly the same as I will say in later panels this morning. If you want sustainability in some areas, you have to go with some very strange bedfellows at times. It's just the way of it. If one can find a champion in the monarchy family, that is often a excellent way forward. And I have found, and I suppose I'm biased, in some cases, if one finds the spouse of a leader or an academic who is well established, you sort of have that champion that you can wrap those things about. But I'm sure Olga has far more practical things than me to say.
Thank you, Cheryl. You already said half of the things I thought, but that's fine. I mean, we're aligned. We think the same. My suggestion would be exactly what Cheryl said. You have to, I can see that you're not from there, but you live there and you work there. So don't forget that as far as we think we know the culture, we are not from there. So I participate in many meetings in all the world, and even in Latin America, speaking the same language. I find differences that sometimes talking, I realize that I say something and people in Colombia doesn't get the same meaning, even with the same language. So what I have learned is that it's never enough what I know from a culture or from someone in a different country. Even though I can speak more than 2 languages, that's not enough. It's always a little bit more to learn from them. So that partnership with a local champion that could be engaged with your activities would be the first step. I would suggest that you start from something small with the idea of growing in the future, but consolidate some critical mass at the beginning. And if you're ISOC member, I am from the Argentina ISOC chapter, you could perhaps organize or lead a project. We in Argentina did a book with a community grants award. With some money, we did a book about IPv6 for all. It's like a dummies, IPv6 for dummies. And it was in Spanish, and it was translated into other languages. And one thing could be you could translate it into Arabic. You could take it as a suggestion from our chapter to yours. And that captured the attention from from the technical people, and from also we engaged some people from the government in writing something. So perhaps you could start with something concrete, or with a meeting from ISOC that they could be arranged there, to informative meeting, and then you can grab some critical mass from the local community and start from there. Build a group that it's multi-stakeholder itself, but the participant of the local. The government is a relevant stakeholder. Even though it's a monarchy or it's a democracy, you need to have them because they are the ones that enforce the law in the community. So their participation is very important. So I would suggest from these first steps, and you have the ISOC help, that they are very keen to help all the chapters and all the members all over the world. So use them in a good sense, and if from our chapter we can exchange some ideas, count on us.
Thank you. That, I think, was an absolutely excellent question. And by the way, I also come from a country which is a monarchy. But I do understand the difference between those two. I'd actually go to something sort of a bit practical in my own experience. When I joined Nominet, the policy development process within the company was based around a small, very inward-looking committee. It was created with 50% from the industry. So it was the registrars, it was the secondary market, and 50%, so the other 8 people, came from different stakeholder groups: the Confederation of British Industry, the United Kingdom Government, the Information Commissioner's Office, and some others. I won't list them all. But these other stakeholders very rarely turned up, because it was boring, because they talked about issues that were rather technical, and people did not see the relevance of them. So that's my first point. You've got to have the issues being seen as relevant to the groups. And if you don't manage to get that done, getting people around the table is very difficult. Second problem is that because many of the appointed members from the wider stakeholder community weren't turning up, then the advice that came out of the model was advice that was very much my own special interest. I'm a registrar, I'm secondary market, I get out of it exactly what I'm putting into it, and I start shaping it, which means that you're then very vulnerable to, this isn't a multi-stakeholder, this is the industry defining its own little rules, and that's not very useful. I joined in 2008, as I said earlier, and by the end of, about a year later, we managed to get to a point where the advisory committee started to think about how it could identify a different approach to doing it. So here we are, sort of recognizing a problem, but you've got your little group already, and you're getting them to start talking about, the way we're doing it is wrong. And then it took us about a year of going through this process to end up with something that looks a little bit like the IGF as a sort of panel, an open forum. And there I'm fully with the earlier comments about creating the table and doing that communication. And a lot of that early stage is the legwork of going out and finding the people who need to be in the room, and sometimes getting it wrong, and then being told, well, why isn't this person in the room, and then having to go out and doing it. But yeah, I really sympathise with you. It's a very, very hard job. And it took us, I think we agreed the new process in 2009. We've now got 2 processes that have gone through, and we've just launched a 3rd one through this process. And every time we've had to think about who might need to be involved, how do we go out and raise it to their attention and get them either to engage or suggest who should be engaged for doing it. And only you locally can do that, I'm afraid. Back to you.
I thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you. Sebastian here. It's to try to do some link between this discussion and the discussion about delegation and redelegation, because I heard Martin say, yes, we need to have, it's a national question, the delegation and redelegation. But one piece I think is missing is that it must be a multi-stakeholder within the country trouble or question or work. And it's not today. It's not at all. We have the obligation to do that at the local, national level, but very often it's understood by nation, it's the government, then it's a decision of the government. And to have the engagement of the other part of the other stakeholders, it's not done in some countries. And how we can solve that, because it's often in quasi-democratic country, not to say worse, and we have no tools to impose the fact that it must be a multi-stakeholder discussion and decision, and it's why I think yes, it's a decision at the national level, but once again, if national it's equal government, it's not enough, and unfortunately it's the case in a lot of countries, or some countries, sorry.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Go. I'll see just briefly.
Briefly, and me? Oh, come on! Yeah, I'm fully with you, Sebastian, on the importance of encouraging multi-stakeholder engagement at that national level to do that underpinning. But the decision at the end of the day does have to be national, and you cannot impose, and ICANN cannot impose. All we can do is encourage, show by good example that if you really want to make a difference, if you really want to make sure that what you're doing is relevant to all your stakeholders so that people come and buy your domain names, then doing the multi-stakeholder thing gives you that strong base from which you can grow, because at the end of the day it doesn't matter how perfect you've defined your CCTLD, if nobody wants to use it, you've wasted your time.
Thanks, Martin. And that was very brief. I appreciate that. That's good man. I wanted to jump in there and say something about what Martin and I have spent a rather ridiculous amount of what we don't call spare time anymore doing, and that's within the CCTLD community, the country code top-level domains. And that's an analysis Martin mentioned of the 2 primary documents that we're looking at. It's called the Framework of Interpretation Work Group. And there's a very important piece of what we've already done. And that is we have agreed in a painful but nevertheless we think successful process what the definition of significantly interested parties are in terms of national delegation and redelegation of country codes. Now, significantly interested parties is the linchpin, I think, here, Sebastian, to what you were raising. We need to take a pincer approach here. Remember that delegation and redelegation is a rarity. as we all touch wood and hope. It's at some end of the spectrum a nuclear option when one needs to, things are not working, we actually can do forced redelegations. But to understand what we mean by the terminology allows us to encourage nation states and CCTLD operators to recognise that they have to, or there is an expectation that they will, and they are expected to prove to IANA that they have managed to or attempted to engage with these significantly interested parties. And it's the result of the work Martin and I and many, many others, far too numerous to name here, going through line by line and definition by definition, that we've expanded that and articulated the types of in-country interests, not limited to, but including, right, the registry operators already existing, national governments, internet end users, business, telco, it's all there. And that's one way of us trying to come in from two ends, because it isn't something we can impose, it's only something we can encourage.
Now I have possibility to comment and to thank you for your question. I fully support all was said, and from my own experience I have to say that it's extremely important to raise awareness, to educate, to speak, to involve, to communicate, to find right peoples, but it's not enough. In quasi-democratic countries, I even don't say about authoritarian countries, it's not enough, and we really need any binding mechanism, not from ICANN, not from IGF. It's impossible to mix these issues, but we have some international organizations. For example, I from Ukraine rely on Council of Europe, on the European Union, and I hope to see more understanding from their part to set minimal standards, especially for governments, to fulfill their respective roles, and that is why I would be happy that it will be happened. I see a remote participant. Okay, see.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We have a question from Cameroon Hub, ISOC Hub. We have two questions actually, but the first one is, don't you think that sometimes the way to involve many stakeholders can be a problem because of difficulty to have consensus between the stakeholders? That was the first question, and the second question is, for you, what is the basic principles of multi-stakeholder? Because for me, we can have many stakeholders, but not take in consideration their voice. Is it multi-stakeholderism? As example, I think about what we call in UN the right of veto that some big country got. Thank you.
Thank you. Who is first?
Very briefly, what is easy in life? I mean, if it's complicated, it's a challenge, and that's what you have to face.
I'll take the two questions separately, but I'll do the second one first. The basic precepts of a multi-stakeholder model are going to be different on the model. I don't think any of us have said, even from our introduction, that there was a one-size-fits-all, right? And yes, there is going to be situations and times where the multi-stakeholder model is not going to be a multi-equal one. There will be a right to veto. There will be disproportionate power articulation, pure funding, the ability to get your people to the table can be quite variable. We often see that between industry and civil society in many constructs. So multi-stakeholder model is a term, it's a grand big bag of lots of different similar principles, but not all of those models are going to have all of the principles. Every multi-stakeholder model I am aware of aims high and falls short. I do not believe there is one that's got it right yet. But what we do have is the opportunity to learn and build on experience from each of those. So I also want to just come back to something that it was in Sebastian's presentation and in one of his later interventions, where he mentioned the desirability in these multi-stakeholder models to have many, many voices at the table. I disagree. Right? You give me 15,000 people in a room, and I'll reckon 5 will come out as leaders. 15,000 voices are not going to be effective. That's a cacophony. We're going to get some who float to the top. This is a natural thing. Leaders happen. We have to empower those leaders and ensure that as they participate on all of our behalf, they are doing the job properly. And when that happens, we often find that some of the fear, where people will want to hold a veto or want to have a particular design of balance of power, that changes as comfort grows and as trust grows. So I know that's a sort of a non-answer, but there is not a one-size-fits-all. It doesn't come off the shelf. Consensus is hard to build, and I guess that is the first question, but it is part of what I just said as well. And my view is tough. If it was easy, everyone would do it. Consensus is hard to build. Rough consensus is a darn good objective. If you can get full consensus, wow, big tick. And some consensus, and it's almost my favourite definition, is the one where everyone is equally discomforted with the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And as so often the case, Cheryl has said a lot of things that I would want to flag. But I would acknowledge that the question from Cameroon is really an important question. What is consensus? Well, Cheryl's already said all the difficulties associated. I'd like to use just a particular example as we try to change our policy process. One of the very first things that we did through our new policy process was a dead easy one. How do you respond to criminal behaviour in use of domain names for routing traffic? And when you haven't got an abuse policy because nobody thought of putting an abuse policy in our terms and conditions when we first started as an organisation. Now, inevitably, you're going to have quite a mass of different views coming into that room. The cacophony, and so we did open consultations, written consultations, we had open meetings, we got people into the room, and then, as Cheryl said, there are certain leaders that you can identify, that you bring them into a room, and you then start discussing. What are you discussing? I'd say you're trying to develop an understanding of the issue and people's take on the issue. What are people worried about? They will tell you that. And that leads you to trying to develop that shared understanding of where you need to put protection in place, where you need to respond to those concerns, and that leads you to trying to identify a series of safeguards. And then, we at the end of that process did not have a full consensus. But we still, because our board would be responsible if they didn't take action in response to something that was blatantly criminal. My company chair wasn't very happy with the idea that she might end up in prison because we hadn't been able to work out how to suspend a domain name that was being used for drug dealing or for money laundering or whatever. And so the board then had a discussion looking at the points that had come forwards and trying to balance those against the safeguards that we'd try to say, well, yeah, that safeguard will actually help respond to those. And then had to make a decision that was then a good decision that everybody equally uncomfortable, everybody sort of slightly concerned with exactly what you've got, but you've got a decision that you know how you got there, and nobody is going to turn around and say that is an illegitimate decision. But going back to the Cameroon's initial question, it's a very, very good question, and I think generally you'll know it when you get there. Because you've built up that common and shared understanding of the problem and the possible ways that you can deal with it. Thank you.
Excuse me, please. Oh, okay, thank you.
Can you hear me? Good morning, everybody. My name is Eric Pigalle. I'm from a European institution, the European Economic and Social Committee. I thought I discovered this concept of a multi-stakeholder model when I came here, and actually after this excellent presentation and that you've done, I realized that I knew the concept, but I didn't know the terminology. I've been doing multi-stakeholdering for many years in France, what we call, and Sébastien might confirm it, paritarism in France. I think it's somehow similar. This is more or less negotiations in industrial sectors with employers, trade unions, government, and so on and so forth. If the comparison is more or less accurate, I have two questions or two remarks. First, my experience of this paritarism. When there is a crisis, I'm wondering if this model is very accurate, because we need a very quick reaction, quick decisions, and then in that case, my experience, it doesn't work. Typical budget, lack of budget, whatever. It has to be quick, not necessarily complicated, but quick decisions. This is the first question. Second question, it's about, if we consider this as a top-down process, the decision process is a top-down. We start from the beginning and it goes up to the field when the decision has been made and it's implemented. Responsibility could be clarified, as Cheryl, you specified earlier on, upfront. What about accountability? Let's assume that whatever has been implemented doesn't work. What about the accountability in the bottom-up process? As a stakeholder, do I feel accountable for the bad decision that happens everywhere, but the bad decision that was made? And this is not very clear. And this can end up making decisions like, oh, I don't care anyway, because I'm not accountable, if you know what I mean. So those are my two questions. Sorry if I was a bit long, but this is important for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent questions and remarks. Now we have 5 minutes, and I would like to invite all of you for final remarks and with answering on questions or maybe any comments, and answering my one more question. Are you equally discomfortable with the results of this discussion? Thank you. Who will be the first?
It's got to be me. I like being first, last, and of course in the middle as well. Yeah. No, I'm not, in fact, equally discomforted. I'm more than comforted about where we are in this discussion, because where we are is at the very beginnings. We're just teasing at the definitions. We're just looking at very immature and very variable constructs, and we are taking it from what is a few countries, nations and organisations' understanding of what this model is, and we're now trying to take it genuinely globally, and that is a very large task. And what we understand in terminology now will have to be reviewed and modified and evolve. But I wanted to come particularly to your questions, if I may, with the time I have. So I've answered your question, now I very much want to answer yours. It's all about a trust model, as far as I'm concerned. No, a multi-stakeholder, top-down or bottom-up, full, engaged, interactive model is never going to be flexible or reactive enough to be able to work in crisis or in a point of failure. It can't. It will not happen. But what can happen is, as a result of the engagement in a multi-stakeholder model and providing that you have good communication and an understanding of what is important about what you communicate, you can say, those 6 people in the room who I understand the core value of and where they were coming from when we were last together said the sky is green. Whilst I may not understand why they said the sky is green, I know that they had to say that, and soon they will tell me why. Now, if you've got that trust model, I think that's the first step. That brings me to your question of the accountability. Well, it's not my problem. We are talking, where we are here, about a global resource, a limited global resource. Access to internet is all about naming, numbers, and the pipes that those things talk to each other over. And they have to be built. There's, the whole IGF model, but also many other models, the ISAP model and everything in between. It is a limited resource, even with IPv6. It's a big resource, but it's a limited resource. And to that, it's a global interest that we have to take. So any decision we make in our component parts is going to affect your great-grandchildren. And we have to think about this, thinking globally, acting locally. It kind of worked in Rio, but we may as well renew that system now. But not just that, we have to future think. We have to future-proof. So it's incumbent on all of us to take that responsibility. When it doesn't work, and it won't all the time, you learn from your experience. When you've had 5 people decide that the sky is green, they need to tell you why. And if they're wrong and it's purple, they need to say, we got it wrong, trust us, we've learned from this experience, and we will remodel our situation. So I know that's not exactly perhaps what you were after, because you're talking about bilateral and still siloed systems. And I've taken that experience set and put it out a little longer. But every time if there's a multiplying factor in trade negotiations and things like that, people come to the table with an agenda. Here we have a festival of agendas. And we need to recognise that not everyone can be happy. But yeah, it is not flexible, and so you need to have trust in command and control to make the right decisions at the right time and be willing to review.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you. And answering your question, Oksana, first, I actually think it's been a useful discussion, very largely because we've had some very useful questions from the audience, and therefore I want to use my time in responding to your questions because, it is very, very important. And I'll just use my company as an example. We run part of the infrastructure. And yes, there will be times when we have to make a crisis decision. I'd say we're in a very comfortable place because we've developed that understanding, that relationship with a wide number of stakeholders so that when we have to respond, we've got a good basis for being able to respond. If we have to do something overnight, then we can probably make a decision that is not too far off what people would then say, yeah, actually, in the circumstances, that was a good decision. So then your accountability point. Yeah, we've made a bad decision. We are going to be accountable. Our board will be accountable to our members, because we are a membership organisation. We'll be certainly responsible and accountable to that wider stakeholder group. And we'll also be questioned by the government. Why did you make that decision? Was this just in your own personal interest, or was it because you thought that was the best way of responding, given the facts you had at the time? These decisions are always a balance. And if we've really, really screwed up, forgive the technical term, then the government has actually got legislation, a backstop legislation called the Digital Economy Act in the UK, that would, if we were recalcitrant, if we refused to change that because and it was a bad decision, they could then start the process of replacing the management of the company. But if you've had to make an emergency decision, I would say any organisation that's had to do that, repent at leisure. You've made your decision for that particular, but now you need to review it. You need to understand whether it was the right decision. And that, I think, is a very similar process that, whether you're in the government ministry, whether you're in a single company, whether you're in a company that runs infrastructure and therefore has that wider responsibility, the same things apply. Yeah, things have gone wrong, deal with it. But deal with it with an understanding. And then sort out and make sure that it was in fact the right decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga.
Thank you. Thank you for the workshop. I think it's very interesting, and you yourself are an example of good outreach and goodwill of changing things in your environment and in your country. So I commend you for that, because I've seen your work since I met you, I think 2 years ago. So going to your question, we also have paritarias in our countries in Latin America, and I know what you talk about. And you brought to me a very interesting thought. There are several multi-stakeholder processes that are not the IGF or national IGFs, or not necessarily related with the internet, but are good examples of how to cooperate among different parties and stakeholders. And I think that paritarias, it's a good example. I think the relevant issue is how accountable are the people that will take the decision. If they are backed up from their own community for their own representation, and if they have done a good job, not only when they meet, but in their daily life with their relationship among their own stakeholder. If they're accountable, if they're respected, and if their group of people do think that they are the right people to do the decision, when they take it, it may be right or wrong. Sometimes when you do decisions very quickly, you may do a mistake. And that happens in all our lives, and it's a chance that you take. But sometimes it's okay, and sometimes how you evaluate it in that moment it made you take some decision that not necessarily was the right one. But if you are accountable and if you are trusted by your own community, then you will have the courage and the ability to explain why you did that and learn from there. Because what I teach to my students is that from your mistakes, you can learn much more than what you learn from what you do good. The things that I remember the most when I was a student, I was a good student at university. I was one of the best of my class. I'm an engineer. But the most I remember is those exams where I had problems and where the teacher told me, that is wrong, and you were not in my class. And those things are kept in my mind almost forever, because I learned from there. What did I do wrong that day? And how could I improve? At least for me, it was very useful. So sometimes not doing the right thing in the moment is not so bad, because you can learn from there and build from there up. Thank you. And thank you for the question. It was very good.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Your comments, and please, what can be results for ICANN from the differentiation between developed countries, quasi-democratic and authoritarian? Is it any importance? Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. First of all, I want to take to thank for your question, because I think your example of paritarism and I hope my initial presentation shows that we can find outside of our world of internet some good example of what we never called, and we didn't imagine that it was multi-stakeholderism, but it was in fact. And when we now try to think about ICANN as an equal multi-stakeholder, it's something, in French we would say paritarisme, because it's really we are at the table with each one with one voice, and it's why what ICANN is trying to do. Then we may revisit some of our group currently existing in different countries, and to see what we can take from them to do better in our job within internet. Multi-stakeholderism didn't born with internet and will not died with internet. The second point is that I think there is a sentence like that: democracy is quite difficult to manage, but we didn't find something better. And multi-stakeholderism, it's almost the same. It's really difficult. It's a difficult path, but we didn't find something better. And I will partly disagree with Cheryl about the fact that multi-stakeholderism can't be used when we have a crisis. I hope that we can go as far as possible using the participation of multiple actors before we have to decide that somebody needs to take a decision against part of the community. I guess it's what our new CEO is trying to do. It's what I call crisis with different items around the new GTID program. He's trying to gather the people who can have a voice, and to try to find a new path to finalize a solution. Of course, if at the end there is too much disagreement, he will have to take a decision. Maybe the board of ICANN will have to take a decision, but we want to try as much as possible to keep the people and the stakeholders involved. Now, about your question, I think I hope that it's still an evolving model, and we need to take into account the fact that there are still part of this world who are not participating because they don't know about what is a multi-stakeholderism, because they have hurdle to put in place multi-stakeholderism, because they don't have time for that, or it's not their first concern. But it's why I think we need to outreach and not just to tell them to participate. And I agree with Cheryl about the fact that I hope that we will never end up to have 15,000 participants in any ICANN meeting. It will be just crazy. Or we will do just a meeting, and we have a good speaker as CEO today, and we will manage. But it's not the same thing that do it multi-stakeholderism. And we really need to take into account that we are diverse. And when I say that, it's personally we are diverse, but culturally we are diverse, linguistically we are diverse, and our country are diversely organized. And we need to find the best way to have as much as possible the participation of a lot of, I would say, people, but much more of organization in each and every country to represent, to talk on behalf, and to be the voice of end user, businesses, providers, and the government. I still think that there are missing pieces. For example, yesterday we were meeting with Parliament MEPs, the Parliament of the European Parliament people who were here, and I say, you have questions, and that's good that we meet at each IGF and sometime in between. But can't you consider to participate to ICANN, or as you participate to IGF? Because it's not just the fact that they are not there, but the concern of the Parliament are not taken into account. It's not the voice of the government or the voice of end user. It's another voice. Then let's try to have as much as possible voices, not as much as possible people participating, as Cheryl say. I hope that I answer your question. And once again, I want to thank you very much for organizing this workshop and the work you are doing, not just here. Generally speaking, I know I visit you in Ukraine, and it's tough, but you are doing well. Thank you very much, Oksana.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you. I highly appreciate all your contribution, but I would like to come back to Wolfgang's words that we need a lot of research on this issue. I invite all of you to continue this discussion. Thank you once again.